Okay, I'd like to pick up where I left off last time. We talked about elk and bison, and so I really want to get into some of the issues of management, particularly with bison, but it also spills over into the elk. And kind of the big bad wolf in this story is a federal agency. Normally when we think national parks and wilderness and so on, we're thinking of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Park Service, U.S. Forest Service, but this agency is APHIS. And APHIS is the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. And so they monitor, among other things, livestock and disease in livestock. And so the issue here has to do with brucellosis in cattle. And so this agency, APHIS, awards a brucellosis status to cattle herds in particular states. And so Montana really seems to be the key state here. And so in terms of brucellosis status then, most states are considered brucellosis free, or this would be so-called free status. And if a state is brucellosis free, that means there are no restrictions on interstate movement of cattle. And then if there is brucellosis occurring in a particular state, there are different statuses for that, and one would be Class A. So in Class A, there's more than one infected herd in a particular management area, so there are management areas within a state within a 2-year period. And if you have Class A status, then the sexually intact cattle over 18 months of age must be tested for brucella, which causes brucellosis, at least 30 days prior to interstate movement. So this is not a terribly strict imposition, but it is somewhat of an imposition on movement of cattle. And so if you're a cattle rancher, you want to be free of any kind of restrictions. So there are certain exemptions from Class A status, and that would be cattle that are from certified brucellosis-free herds. So those are herds that have been tested. Those that are going directly to slaughter do not have to be tested. And then those that are being transferred to approved markets where they will be tested for brucella. And then Class B status is an intermediate status between, in terms of restriction, between A and C. And then Class C status is going to be the most restrictive. So again, Class B would be where you have multiple infected herds in a 2-year period in a certain area. Intermediate restrictions between Class A and C. And then Class C status is where there's a lot of brucellosis in an area, highest brucellosis concentrations. And here, potentially, herds can be subject to federal quarantine. And if they're quarantined, then there's no movement, potentially even within state, but certainly between states. So in response to this, an interagency bison management plan has been developed, and part of this was in response to the state of Montana. So Montana initiated a bison hunt to try to protect their herds and try to justify to APHIS that they were trying to prohibit brucella infections in their state. The feds, National Park Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife didn't like that and were potentially going to sue for that, but Montana sued them first, saying that there were conflicting interests between the National Park Service and APHIS. And so this led then to eventually an environmental impact study. EIS refers to an environmental impact study, so that was required, eventually done, and a temporary plan was put together, and a final plan, environmental impact study, and eventually an interagency bison management plan was implemented in 2000. And it has a lot of critics, and I'll come back to some of these criticisms in just a second. But in terms of elements of the bison management plan, there are different phases to this based on whether brucellosis is occurring and how much brucellosis is occurring and so on. But in phase 1, basically it limits, and I should also mention that this management plan is restricted to Yellowstone National Park and some of the lands around Yellowstone National Park. This doesn't really apply so much to the Teton area. So anyway, phase 1 limits bison primarily Yellowstone National Park, and there's one management area as well where they're restricted. And then by phase 3, some cattle are permitted in some of these restricted areas, up to 100. And there are actually unlimited bison permitted in certain northern management areas in all 3 of these developmental phases. But for the most part, bison are restricted to Yellowstone National Park, and outside the park they become vulnerable. So as we look at the park, again, the biggest areas are going to be in this north entrance and also along the west side. That's where the biggest management problems exist, with bison wandering out of the park. So anyway, in this management plan then, all the bison that wander outside the park and the north and west entrances then are removed and sent to slaughter. And typically this meat is donated to different charities. And again, that's going to be in this north entrance and west entrance. And anyway, bison movement is monitored as part of the system. Hazing of bison to try to keep them from leaving the park, or if they leave the park, they try to get them back into the park. And I didn't really talk about this when we talked about bison earlier, but they are hard to haze. They will do whatever they want. They stop in the middle of roads. They have no respect for traffic or really anything else. So they're kind of arrogant in that way. But as a result, then it's hard to move them around. They don't really care about firecrackers or anything like that, so they're tough to manage. Other elements of the interagency bison management plan include investigating techniques for vaccinating bison, and part of the problem here is that there's not a really good vaccine for brucella or brucellosis, especially in bison. We don't know how effective it is. And it also prevents a bison hunt, so both Montana and Wyoming are exploring and expanding their bison hunts, basically listing them as game animals and managing that. And then also there's been some testing on quarantining young animals and then releasing them once they're clear of brucella, or testing them for brucella, and if they're clear, then releasing them later. And then also the plan does permit tribal hunts by some of the local tribes. So just to give you an idea of the kind of mortality that we're talking about as part of this management plan, animals being sent to slaughter, it can really fluctuate widely. So in just 2 successive years looking at this, in 2006, 953 bison were sent to slaughter, basically, or killed in their hunts. And then the following year, in 2007, only 15 were killed. So if you look over about the last 10 years or so, there have sometimes been over 1,000 bison killed. Other times it will be in single digits. So it can really fluctuate widely, and most of that has to do with the winter. If there are mild winters, the bison can move more freely and they'll wander out of the park and then create problems outside the park. So one of the things here that's a bit of a problem is that the focus is on bison management, and there's kind of an irony here, because bison really aren't the problem if you really want to control brucellosis in cattle populations. The problem really is elk, but the elk are largely ignored. So when you look at the ecosystem, there are probably in the neighborhood of 45 to 65,000 elk in the ecosystem. If you look at Wyoming, there's 93,000 elk at the count this year in Wyoming alone. You compare that to bison in Yellowstone National Park, there's only about 5,000 bison in the park, another 1,100 down in the Teton area. And so comparatively, there are relatively few bison. Also, there are no confirmed cases of bison transmission of brucellosis to cattle. They're usually not in the same place at the same time. So when bison wander out of the park, it's in winter, and then in spring, when they're going to give birth, they move back into the park. And the problem here is that with brucellosis, and I'm not sure if you remember when we talked about this earlier, is that brucellosis does cause abortion of the first fetus typically. It's not really outrighly fatal to the animals typically, but it does cut down on cattle production. So anyway, and it's transmitted by feeding on contaminated grasses that have been contaminated with brucella. So again, that's usually when you're going to, if you have animals that are giving birth in an area where animals are feeding, that's when you can get transmission of brucellosis. But the thing here is that bison will move out of the park, they'll feed, then they move back into the park, and that's where they give birth. So you're not really, and then in the summers, people will bring in their cattle to feed where the bison had been previously. But there's just not really an avenue for transmission there. So again, this whole plan doesn't stand up to the biology, really. And then comparatively, elk, wander throughout the ecosystem. They're wandering all over the place, and there's no plan for them. So much bigger numbers. They also carry the brucella bacterium, yet we focus on bison and basically ignore the elk. So why a bison management plan? Why not an elk management plan? Or why not a robust elk management plan? And it really comes down to money. So there is a massive elk hunt, kind of, as I've mentioned before. Elk is big money in the fall during the hunting season. So it's all about economics. If you want to regulate elk, if you want to cut down on elk numbers, that's going to cut into the hunting economy. So in Wyoming alone, there were 21,000 elk last year, and so again, it's big numbers. And there really is no significant bison hunt. So, why does the Park Service go along with this? Well, there are reasons, and the reasons are a little bit different in both parks. So in Yellowstone National Park, the biggest problem there is that the bison are deforesting that particular ecosystem. The problems and management is a little bit different in Grand Teton National Park, and we taped a little segment regarding this in Grand Teton National Park when we were up there last summer. So let me have you take a look at that right now. So when we look at bison populations, then one of the questions that comes up is, well, why is there a need for management of bison herds? Why do bison herds need to be limited? And the answer really is off to my left. This is a lodgepole pine, and you can see that the bark has been severely damaged, and that's bison damage. So bison, as they come out of winter, like to rub the wool off on trees, and also they sharpen their horns on the trees. Males also will sharpen their horns and kind of act aggressively on the trees, damaging the bark, eventually damaging the phloem to the point that sugars can no longer be transported to the roots. The roots starve, that kills the tree. You might say, well, who cares so much about the tree? But then that leads to more grasses, which means more forage for the bison, which means more bison young, more bison population, which means more tree damage. So effectively what the bison are doing is deforesting the park, deforesting the ecosystem. And as a result, there is a need for management of the herd. So this was one of the justifications for reintroducing wolves to the park. As expected, wolves initially started feeding on elk, and that was also one of the justifications for bringing in wolves. The managers wanted them to actually go after the elk. But as the elk populations are decreasing then, what's happening is that the wolves are actually now turning to the bison population, which was also part of the plan. However, this will not be enough. So there are other management practices that are needed to control the bison population to try to mitigate the amount of deforestation that is occurring. So ultimately then, there is a problem with having too many bison. And there is a natural solution here, potentially is the wolf, and we'll come back to that later. If wolves could expand their territory as they cut down on the elk population, they would be able to turn to bison. But unfortunately, at this point in time, there's not enough patience really to let that happen, and also there's just not the facilities in the area to permit this to happen. But that's something I'll come back to a little bit later. All right, so looking at other members of the Artiodactyla then that we find in the Yellowstone ecosystem, there's a number of important Artiodactylans. So one of these would be the Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep. So this is a female. You can see that they have true horns. And again, they're incredibly nimble. We find them, in one of the places you can see them is in the Tower area. Also, Mount Washburn, you typically see a lot of bighorn sheep. Also out towards in the northeast part of the park, towards Gardner, Montana, the Mammoth area, you can see bighorn sheep out there as well. Rams will have much larger horns than the ewes. This is actually a young ram. And again, they'll enter their breeding season in the fall, battle over females, and then mate. And this is a population that's been relatively stable to shrinking. It certainly has never rebounded. You may recall early in the course we were talking about disease. They suffered a chlamydia infestation back in the 1980s. They've also periodically suffered from pneumonia infestations, and they just can't seem to get over the hump again. Numbers are relatively low, possibly declining slowly, but relatively stable, I would say, but much lower than they were 20 or 30 years ago. Moose are abundant throughout the ecosystem. Moose have the large palmate antlers, and some of the bulls, you can look at spans of about 5 feet. They're massive. They can easily stand 7 feet at the shoulder, some of the bulls. And one of the more dangerous animals in the park as well, especially cows with calves that you'd be likely to encounter in the summer months. Moose population has declined with the reintroduction of the wolf. They were surprised by this. They haven't really done well with the wolf reintroduction. However, the numbers have begun to climb again recently, especially in the Teton area, and they've actually had a behavioral adaptation to this. One of the things that the cows have begun to do is they've started they've started burying their calves close to roads. Generally speaking, wolves don't stay close to the roads, and so by calving close to the roads, that helps protect the young until they get old enough to fend for themselves. So you tend to find moose up in the canyons. You'll find them in areas where you have lots of willows. And again, generally I would say in decline, not a steep decline, but a slow decline. And there is some curiosity about what will happen over the next several years. So we're going to talk about the trophic cascade that's a result of the wolves being reintroduced, but there is some idea that the moose may be able to recover. And certainly not being decimated. They are a frequent observation in the park. They're really extraordinary animal. And again, follow the same kind of pattern as most of these we've talked about. So the antlers grow, they joust and fight for females in the fall. And I've been lucky enough to see that. And I would say one of the really great times to go to this area is in the fall, if you can ever get up there, because you have all of these animals like the bighorn sheep, elk, deer, bison, all fighting over females, and it's a very dynamic time. They'll be, calling and making all kinds of sounds as well. So it's really an extraordinary time to be there. Also, the crowds are very, very low. So usually after Labor Day, it's perfect. And like I said earlier, cows with calves are really what you have to be careful of in the summer months because they'll be more protective. And then as you move into the fall, when the rut begins, then males can be more aggressive. And you'll see them all along waterways as well. So they prefer aquatic vegetation and willows. Another very common sight in the ecosystem would be the pronghorn. Some people call them pronghorn antelope. They're not a true antelope. Antelope are found in Africa and Asia, but we call them the pronghorn. So they have a true horn. They're the only horned mammal that has a fork in it. And this would be a buck. You can see the bucks have a large cheek patch, sometimes throat patch. It's very dark and bold. They'll be broad in the chest and a really wide span on the horns, and the horns will be very large as well. They're the fastest mammal in North America. Incredibly fast, and they can sustain their speeds for miles and miles and miles. So another look at a buck, great look at the horns. And then females can have horns, but they'll be much smaller, and a lot of females lack horns as well. And typically in the day, you'll find both males and females, lounging in grasses or hiding under sagebrush, trying to get a little bit of shade. But you just don't find them in forested areas at all. They like open land where they can run. And the young are probably the most vulnerable of the animals. Once they have enough speed, they're pretty safe. But the biggest, I would say, risk to a pronghorn in this ecosystem is really winter. So they have to be able to get out of this area. So the pronghorn migration is a really important migration, especially down in the Teton area. So they have to migrate out of the Teton area. In the northern range, up in the northern part of Yellowstone, they can migrate out with bison and elk and so on into lower elevations. But in the Teton area, it's a very restricted migration, and it's at risk. So this is approximately the migration route that they take. And so they will, again, migrate out of the Teton area to the south. And if they can't do that, if they don't do that, they will die. They aren't like bison. They can't burrow their way through the snow to get to the forage. There's just too much snow up there, and so they'll starve to death. And occasionally small groups will decide they don't want to migrate out of the area. A couple of years ago, there was a group of 37. They decided not to migrate, and they ended up freezing to death, starving to death in the ecosystem. And then a few years before that, there was a group of 31 that decided not to migrate. So if they don't get out of the area, they are going to die. So anyway, this is an ancient migratory route. It's been around for almost 6,000 years. It's one of the longest ones for mammals in North America, up to 350 miles. Some of these will migrate to get to the right vegetation. And the real problematic thing about their migratory route is there are some severe bottlenecks. There are some areas where it's really restricted. So some of the distances that they're confined to, 660 yards. One place it's about 300 yards, and as little as 120 yards. So you can imagine that if there's something going on in those bottlenecks, this is a spooky kind of animal too. They're not going to push it, so they will retrace steps, maybe find another way, but maybe not. So this is a route that they know, and if they're scared off this route, then they will abandon the route and go back to where they were. So there are a lot of risks to this route that have developed over the last several years. There have been some oil and gas leases that have been granted and then later removed that are potentially a problem here. There was actually a dam proposal over a river along their route, one of the bottlenecks that would have completely blocked their path. Also, we have development constantly, a lot of farmland and so on. Fences are a real problem for pronghorns. They're incredibly fast and athletic, but they don't like to jump over things. It's really bizarre. So just a barbed wire fence especially, they will not jump over it. And you'll see pronghorns moving along these fences for miles and miles, and eventually they'll try to squeeze under them. So they like to go under things rather than over things. So just a simple fence can be a severe obstacle for them. And then also road building is a problem, because then you also have a lot of deaths from collisions with cars. Also, again, they're kind of spooky. They don't like to cross roads very much. And usually there's fences along roads. So all of these are obstacles that have been proposed along this routeway or at one time or another. Some of these have been introduced, and there's a lot of concern about, you know, the survival of pronghorn if something happens to this migratory route. All right, so next I would like to talk about another order of eutherians, and those would be the carnivora, the carnivores. And there are a number of important carnivores in the ecosystem. And one of the things that distinguishes carnivores from other animals, other mammals, again, would be the teeth. And so when you look at the teeth of a carnivore, and this is a dog skull, most of the carnivores, there are a few exceptions, but most of the carnivores have what we call carnassial premolars and molars. And so as we look at these teeth here, you can see as I turn the skull over that these are really flat. So these are not really grinding premolars, and even this first molar here is not really for grinding. It's only these last two that have any kind of a grinding surface at all. These molars are for shearing meat, slicing meat. So we refer to these as carnassial teeth. And that's pretty typical of the carnivores. So within the carnivora, there are several families that I would like to discuss. And so the first of these is the Ursidae, family Ursidae. Ursidae are the bears. And in the Yellowstone ecosystem, there are two bears, the grizzly bear and the black bear. And sometimes grizzly bear is referred to as the brown bear. I'm hearing that more and more, but I'll refer to it as a grizzly bear. Anyway, the grizzly bear, again, is just a major, awesome predator in the ecosystem. I will say up front that it's great to see grizzly bears, but you want to see them way far away. You don't want to see a grizzly bear up front. And what distinguishes the grizzly bears physically is the large hump. So the hump is higher than the rump. That's one of the ways that you remember. They also tend to have a dish-like face. That's another characteristic of the grizzly. And then also massive claws. So, you know, when we take field classes up there, again, we try to see them at a distance, and this is where a spotting scope comes in handy, because a spotting scope will bring you right up close to the grizzly, even though it may be hundreds of yards away or thousands of yards away sometimes. That's how you want to see grizzlies. So when we're hiking in this ecosystem, you want to make noise. If you're hiking alone, you definitely want to clap, wear bells, do something. And with bigger groups, conversation is good. And so that gives the bear time to move off of the trail. And I have more than once heard bears huff and move off of the trail just ahead of us, even though I thought we were making quite a bit of noise. So you don't want to end up face to face with a grizzly, especially a female grizzly with a cub. That's going to be a bad, bad situation. So again, as we look at grizzlies, it's really all about the power in those shoulders. Grizzlies are diggers, so that's why they have those big claws. That's why they have those powerful shoulders. They're not good climbers. They can potentially get up trees, so a lot of people think they can escape grizzlies up trees. That's not always the case. And they're fast and powerful. So if a grizzly does get to you, you want to play dead. And when you hike in the ecosystem, you want to carry bear spray. You can buy bear spray in the area, and bear spray should not be in your pack. It should be in your hand or easily accessible, because you're not going to have time to dig it out of a pack if you do find yourself in trouble. And in fact, bear spray is more effective than a firearm. So again, we've seen them throughout the ecosystem, and the grizzly bears are actually doing pretty well over the last several years, and they have been delisted, and that's something I'll talk about here in a couple of minutes. And one of the reasons that they're doing well is they've benefited from wolf reintroduction. Wolves kill bison, they kill elk, and then grizzlies come in and will steal carcasses from them. So there's a real dynamic there. Sometimes the wolves win, sometimes the grizzlies win, but it has to do with the size of the wolf pack and so on. But overall, I would say that grizzlies have benefited from reintroduction of the wolf. So again, the business part of the grizzly is going to be those claws. So those claws can be up to 4 inches long. One of the ways you distinguish grizzlies from black bears, if you see tracks, as you look at the front paws, it's more or less straight across. If you connect the opposite toes, the base of the toes, it's more or less a straight line to the direction they're going, and it doesn't cut through the foot pad very much. Also, you'd look for evidence of the claws. And so again, here's a grizzly track here. If we connect across, it's more or less fairly straight to the direction of, or perpendicular to the direction of movement. A black bear toe would be further down here, and the angle would be greater. Also, as you look at the distance here, these are massive claws. Black bears don't have anywhere near the kind of claws length that grizzlies have. Now, in terms of the life cycle of grizzlies, the females typically give birth to the young. They give birth to the young in the den when they're hibernating, actually. And they will be extremely small. They're very undeveloped. And then they'll come out of the den with those cubs, and those are known as cubs of the year. And typically there's 2 cubs, usually 1 or 2. Occasionally you'll see 3. And then the cubs will stay with the mother that summer. They'll den with her that following year. Then she'll come out of hibernation with the cubs. They'll spend the second year with her, the second summer with her, learning from her where to feed and so on, and then den with her again. And then when she comes out in that 3rd year, that's typically when she goes into estrus again. And by then, the cubs are pretty well grown. She'll either run them off, or more typically what happens is when males come into the area to mate, the boars, they will run off the cubs if they're still alive. Hopefully they are. And so then at the end of that season then, as they come out then in May or June, that's when mating occurs. And the female actually will be fertilized, and the embryo actually delays implantation until the following winter. So she can go into estrus several times. She can mate many times during that season. And then when she goes into hibernation, if she's got enough body fat to support development of the cubs, then the embryo implants and development will continue. If not, the embryo goes out of the uterus and she will not be pregnant that year. And then we'll try again the next year. So body fat has a lot to do with successful pregnancies here. And that's a pretty typical life cycle. And also it's the same in black bears as it is in the grizzly bears. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, because grizzly management is also another big political issue, hot button issue in the ecosystem, and that's something I'll be talking about in our next module. So again, grizzly bears, major predator, and then I'll also be talking about black bears and the differences between the two. So I'll see you next time.